Welcome back. You're watching KTN Business Today with me, Abi Agina, and this is the second part of the program. I'm going to dissect matters that have continued to define the economy for the last week, and we are joined by Kenneth Gichinga, who is the chief economist at Mentoria Consulting. And Ken, pleasure to have you here this afternoon.
Thanks for having me again. And
one of the key issues that came up through the week was the president laying out his agenda during the Jamhuri Day speech. He did bring about 4 critical issues that his administration will be channeling efforts towards. Perhaps how feasible are these? He talked about housing, he talked about universal health, he also talked about matters to do with, there's actually housing, health, agriculture and food security.
Right.
Thanks for that. Perhaps, do you think this is what the economy currently needs?
Absolutely. If you look at every economy in the world, it starts from agriculture, goes into manufacturing, industrialization, and ultimately goes into services. Mm-hmm. But what we've seen in Kenya is we made a leap from agriculture straight into services. Kenya has become a service-driven economy. Mm-hmm. So we missed out a whole phase in the industrialization phase that many economies in Europe and the United States generated a lot of wealth.
Sure.
So I think right now it's sort of like recalibrating that cycle and saying, yes, agriculture takes 25%, but let's move from agriculture to manufacturing because there's still a lot of jobs to be created. So I think for me, it's something we've long called for as economists. Manufacturing has only taken about 10% of this economy when it can produce much, much more. So I'd like to see that sort of like linear movement of the economic transformation happening in Kenya.
All right. He also talked about healthcare,
Yes.
indicating that he wants to see the cost of healthcare come down. Correct. And of course touch a bigger base of the society. And right now we know we have the NHIF in place, and it has had its share of problems really when it comes to its effectiveness. And perhaps what sort of innovations should we consider moving forward so that we can ensure we have universal healthcare for the Kenyans?
The challenge with healthcare and education, these are the 2 social sectors that really anchor an economy. The challenge with healthcare is there are always 2 debates. It's always about quality or about access. For example, in the American market, it's more on quality, while in the European market, it's more on access. In Kenya, we're trying to have both access and quality, and sometimes that's always a challenge. I think the idea of having every Kenyan covered is noble. For me, the health economics sometimes could be a bit difficult because you have to look at the supply side and the demand side.
Sure.
The supply side of doctors, supply sides of drugs, the demand side in Kenya far outstrips. If you look at the doctor-to-patient ratio in Kenya, it's very, very high compared to what developed countries have. So for me, can we have enough medical schools producing enough doctors? Can we have enough drug companies producing enough drugs? Only then can we sort of start talk about a meaningful healthcare outcome. So I think the supply side is still far outweighed by the demand side.
All right. Yeah. And let's talk about the food security component he
Correct.
mentioned in his plan.
Right.
Right now we had the Galana Kulalu Food Security Project, which has also had a false start of sorts.
Right.
It was meant to put under 1 million acres under irrigation.
Right.
And this was supposed to basically boost food security in the country. The project has had a really tough time kicking off.
Right.
We also did see the water issues with the water dams, the politics around this, and of course this ties into the agricultural issues and the cost of inputs. What are you seeing that will be critical in the policies moving forward?
In terms of food security, if you remember the campaign season, it was such a hot button topic. It nearly derailed the Jubilee campaign. So obviously that was always going to be the first things because the
cost of unga.
Politics of unga is very, very complex. And they quickly had to sort of like intervene. And I think right now the question is, And to be honest, the Agricultural Ministry has about 7-point policy plan on how to deal with agriculture. You've touched on cost of inputs, cost of fertilizer, the land issues. We need to talk about land issues. If you look at counties like Kiambu, where almost every piece of land is going into real estate, that's a big area in terms of can we get food security? And I think in the fullness of time, we need to have food security per county. Every county needs to have its own strategies on food security, because I think right now we have the bread basket zones, which have sort of dominated. But in terms of innovation, I think that's a fantastic question. What innovations can be applied? And this goes back to value chains. How do we link SMEs, which are the drivers of the economy, to the big multinationals, which eventually control the industry? And that has always been the biggest issue. So even if you look at his speech at the Council of Governors induction yesterday, it was all about how do we get these SMEs in our counties to link to the value chains in terms of producing inputs for the big multinationals, because the multinationals have benchmarks for quality. They just can't accept any input. So how do we make sure our SMEs, especially in the agricultural sector, are producing enough quality material that can be accepted by the Monsantos of this world?
Sure.
Yeah.
And finally, on the 4 agendas, there was housing.
Correct.
Housing is a contentious issue, looking at the rapid urbanization that we continue to witness in Kenya. And the president did also mention that they are going to increase the number of units that are delivered to the market by giving incentives to developers. Perhaps, what's the way out of this in terms of affordable housing?
And I think this is something we've debated in the past, because we've discussed how housing is a devolved function. So should we follow the British model, where counties have their own county councils and sort of develop property and you pay rent to them? That could be one way, but pure economists are against that model, because they say the government should keep out. They should only provide incentives for private developers to come and sort of like participate. I think a mix of both is fine, because if you look at what happens in the United Kingdom, you still have council houses, but also you still have private developers coming in. For me, counties are constantly saying they don't have alternative revenue sources besides what they get from the national government. I think if they have housing plans in the urban areas, the rents they could be collecting from those houses, I think would be a fantastic way of sort of supplementing what they get from the national government. Yeah.
And looking at housing, before we close off on that issue, right now the rental yield has been on the upswing. We're seeing rents within Nairobi shooting through the roof, and this is pushing many people to go to satellite towns. And how can the national government now work with the county governments, for instance, Kajiado, where people are going, or let's say Kiambu, guys are also going towards Thika? What sort of integrated model can best work? Of course, you did mention the issues in London and how they've been able to address it, but looking at the Kenyan scenario,
Right.
what model will best work?
Yesterday I saw a tweet from the Deputy Governor, Polycarp Igathe, and he talked about the immense wastage of land in Nairobi. There's a lot of idle land. So even before people start moving to the surrounding counties, we have to have a conversation. Why is there so much idle land in Nairobi? And the reality is we don't have a proper tax code that sort of addresses idle land. In any major city, in any major metropolis, to have idle land in a capital city is almost unheard of, because the property rates are so high that nobody can even afford to have nothing. So for me, I think we need to address that issue of the taxation of land around Nairobi, because once we have that in place, there'll be so much surplus, people will free up so much land that the issue of housing will no longer be an issue. Right now, the reason it's an issue is because you have people sitting on large idle chunks of land, forcing other people to go further and further away. So I think for me, taxation, and it's an alternative form of revenue. So for me, the issue is the tax code has to be revised in a way that makes sense for both landlords and tenants.
All right, and wrapping up on that topic, let's talk about how the shilling has performed and the NSE at large. We've seen the NSE 20 index for the last 2-3 days has lost about 17 points. What do you make of market activity right now? Many had hoped things would perhaps tick upwards now that everything is back to normal?
Right. Two words, excess capacity. Let me explain. Everybody, after the political season, everybody expected the economy to just switch back on. The reality is that won't happen. What's going to happen is you're going to have a gradual increase in performance. Why? Is because you have those two words of excess capacity. A lot of companies are producing much less than their optimal, to the extent that companies are even forcing their employees to be laid off and stuff. So anytime you have excess capacity in an economy, in terms of the economy is producing way, way below what it can, there has to be some consolidation in the industry, especially where technology is a disruptor. I'm talking of the media, I'm talking of banking sector,
Right.
I'm talking of anywhere where there's a technological alternative, you always find consolidation. So my estimate is we're going to have 3 months first of consolidation before you see that uptake that we are expecting to happen.
Excellent analysis. Many thanks, Ken Gichinga.
Always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Great speaking